The atmosphere across Weatherfield had changed so dramatically after Theo's death that even the smallest interactions between neighbors now carried a strange undercurrent of suspicion. Conversations that once felt ordinary had become careful and restrained, as though everyone feared saying the wrong thing in a street already poisoned by gossip, police questions, and private paranoia. Rainwater still glistened along the cobbles beneath the yellow glow of the streetlights, but the familiar comfort of the neighborhood had disappeared completely. In its place remained a growing sense that somebody close to the community was hiding something terrible, and the longer the investigation dragged on, the more that fear spread quietly from house to house. Inside the home he shared with Christina, George stood motionless near the window, staring blankly toward the empty street below while his thoughts spiraled deeper into exhaustion. Since Theo's murder, every hour of every day had become consumed by anxiety. Police attention had settled heavily on him from the very beginning, and although he tried convincing himself that innocence would eventually protect him, the reality of the investigation was beginning to crush that hope. He could feel suspicion tightening around him like a slow-moving trap, especially whenever detectives questioned him about timelines, arguments, or evidence connected to the night Theo died. The emotional strain had already started changing him in ways he barely recognized. He no longer slept properly, and when he did drift off, he often woke moments later with the sickening feeling that someone was accusing him again. Even silence had become unbearable because it gave his mind too much room to replay every detail from that night. Theo's death was no longer simply a tragedy hanging over Weatherfield. It had become a psychological weight pressing down on everyone connected to the case, forcing fear into relationships that once felt secure. When the front door finally opened later that evening, George turned immediately, expecting reassurance the moment Christina returned from the police station. Instead, the sight of her unsettled him almost instantly. She entered the house carrying a nervous energy she clearly could not conceal no matter how hard she tried. Her face looked pale beneath the harsh hallway light, and her breathing carried the uneven rhythm of someone desperately attempting to regain composure after a deeply uncomfortable experience. Although Christina tried behaving normally, every movement betrayed tension. She removed her coat too carefully, avoided direct eye contact for several seconds, and rubbed her hands together repeatedly while crossing the room. The silence between them stretched awkwardly because George immediately sensed that something during her police interview had shaken her far more than she wanted to admit aloud. What frightened him most was not simply her nervousness itself, but the realization that Christina seemed genuinely rattled in a way he had not seen before. Eventually, after sitting down heavily, Christina admitted there was something she had forgotten to mention during earlier questioning surrounding Theo's death. Her voice sounded measured at first, but underneath the calmness sat unmistakable panic. She explained that on the night Theo died, before collecting Todd, she had stopped to get petrol. According to her, the detail had slipped her mind because everything connected to that evening had become chaotic and emotionally overwhelming. The explanation itself sounded simple enough, yet the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately after she said it. George could feel the significance of the omission settling heavily between them. In murder investigations, forgotten details rarely remained harmless for long. Police examined gaps in timelines obsessively, especially when those gaps created periods where movements could not be verified. Christina now had exactly such a gap, and George understood instantly how dangerous that could become once detectives revisited her statement. What disturbed him further was the visible anxiety with which Christina delivered the information. She kept watching his reaction carefully, almost as though she feared not simply police suspicion, but his judgment as well. That subtle tension quietly planted uncertainty inside him for the first time since the investigation began. Until now, George had viewed Christina as the one person beside him entirely. Yet something about her behavior that evening felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Instead of lingering on the subject of the petrol station stop for very long, Christina quickly redirected the conversation towards Summer and the journal that had recently become a source of concern. George noticed how determined she suddenly appeared while discussing it. The nervousness surrounding her own forgotten timeline seemed to transform into urgency the moment attention shifted towards Summer instead. Christina argued that George could no longer afford to remain silent while police focused so heavily on him. She carefully reminded him that investigators already considered him one of the strongest suspects in Theo's murder, and she repeatedly returned to the same underlying idea without saying it directly. If another lead existed, police deserved to know about it before George's situation worsened further. The emotional pressure she placed on him slowly intensified throughout the conversation. She never outright demanded that he betray Summer, but every sentence subtly pushed him toward that conclusion. According to Christina, Summer's journal contained emotional material that investigators might consider relevant. George initially resisted the idea because the thought of involving Summer in the investigation filled him with guilt almost immediately. Summer had once trusted both of them completely. She had spent time inside their home during vulnerable periods of her life, sharing fears and emotions she never imagined would later become potential evidence in a murder inquiry. George understood that journals often contain thoughts written during moments of emotional collapse rather than genuine intentions, yet he also knew how easily police could interpret anger or distress as motive once suspicion entered the picture. The possibility of turning Summer into another target weighed heavily on him because he understood exactly what public suspicion could do to someone emotionally fragile. Since Theo's death, Weatherfield had already become consumed by rumors, accusations, and fear. George had experienced firsthand how quickly people started looking at you differently once your name became linked to violence. The idea of placing Summer into that same nightmare filled him with shame. Even so, Christina refused to let the matter go. As the evening continued, her insistence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. She spoke about George's future, about how dangerous it was for him to remain at the center of the investigation, and about how police might eventually assume silence itself was suspicious. Yet beneath all her arguments lingered something else George could not fully ignore: desperation. At moments, Christina seemed more terrified than he was. That imbalance slowly began unsettling him because it no longer felt like ordinary concern from someone protecting a partner. Her fear carried a sharper edge, one that appeared tied not only to George's safety, but to the possibility of police continuing to dig deeper into the timeline surrounding Theo's death. As George listened to her, fragments of recent events replayed painfully inside his mind. Christina's reaction to the bloody jumper suddenly resurfaced with alarming clarity. At the time, her urgency to get rid of it had seemed understandable because any incriminating-looking evidence connected to George naturally frightened her. Yet now, combined with her forgotten petrol station stop and her relentless determination to redirect suspicion elsewhere, the memory began taking on a far darker meaning. George hated himself for even considering the possibility forming in his thoughts, but he could not stop wondering whether Christina's panic came from more than fear for him alone. The realization horrified him because it threatened the last stable thing he still believed in. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Weatherfield, Summer remained completely unaware that private thoughts written during emotional turmoil were slowly becoming dangerous ammunition within a murder investigation. Like many people struggling under pressure, she had poured complicated emotions into her journal without imagining anyone else would ever read them. The pages represented confusion, anger, grief, and vulnerability rather than criminal intent. Yet George knew police rarely viewed such things through a compassionate lens once a homicide investigation intensified. Hours later, unable to quiet the pressure building inside him, George finally left the house alone and wandered slowly through the cobbles beneath the cold night air. Every step carried visible hesitation because deep down he already sensed he was approaching a decision capable of damaging lives permanently. The streets felt unusually empty around him, amplifying the noise of his own thoughts until the silence became almost unbearable. When he eventually spotted DS Connor Swain nearby, George hesitated before approaching her. Fear, exhaustion, and Christina's relentless warnings had worn down his resistance so thoroughly that he no longer trusted his own judgment properly. Connor Swain immediately recognized his discomfort and listened carefully as he struggled to explain why he wanted to speak privately. Even then, George repeatedly insisted he did not want Summer getting into trouble. Guilt saturated every word because he already understood the contradiction of what he was doing. By mentioning the journal at all, he was opening a door that could not easily be closed again. Once police attached significance to Summer's writings, the investigation would inevitably begin circling her as well. The moment he revealed the information, regret settled over him almost immediately. Walking home afterward, George felt emotionally hollow, as though fear had pushed him into betraying someone who never deserved it. Theo's death had not only shattered lives through violence itself, it had begun corrupting trust between people, forcing frightened individuals into choices they would later struggle to forgive themselves for. Back inside the house, Christina waited anxiously for him to return. The instant he entered, she searched his face with nervous intensity before he even spoke. And when George quietly admitted he had told Connor Swain about Summer's journal, a brief expression crossed Christina's face so quickly she almost hid it in time. Relief. Not simple reassurance, not sadness for Summer, but unmistakable relief. Although she quickly masked it beneath concern, George still noticed the reaction, and once he saw it, he could not unsee it. The feeling that settled inside him afterward was colder and more frightening than anything police had said to him so far. Because for the first time since Theo's murder, George began wondering whether the person he should fear most might already be sitting beside him inside his own home. The following morning arrived over Weatherfield beneath a thick grey sky that seemed to press low against the rooftops, trapping the entire street beneath a suffocating atmosphere of unease. News of Theo's murder had already spread through every corner of the community days earlier, yet instead of fading with time, the tension surrounding the investigation continued growing heavier with each passing hour. People still gathered in cafes and outside shops pretending to discuss ordinary matters, but sooner or later every conversation drifted back toward the same terrifying question: who had really killed Theo, and how many secrets were still hiding beneath the surface of the street? For George, the weight of that question had become almost impossible to escape. After revealing the existence of Summer's journal to D.S. Connor Swain the previous night, he woke with a crushing sense of regret sitting heavily in his chest. Even before opening his eyes fully, he already felt the shame waiting for him. The memory of Connor Swain's careful expression as she absorbed the information replayed over and over in his head, forcing him to confront what he had done. Although fear had pushed him toward the decision, guilt now followed closely behind it, refusing to let him find peace. The house itself felt different that morning. Silence lingered awkwardly between him and Christina, no matter how hard both of them tried pretending otherwise. Small domestic sounds that once felt comforting now seemed unnaturally sharp inside the tense atmosphere surrounding them. The scrape of a chair across the kitchen floor, the sound of a kettle boiling, even the ticking clock on the wall all appeared amplified by the emotional strain neither of them openly addressed. George watched Christina carefully throughout breakfast without fully meaning to. Ever since noticing the flash of relief crossing her face after he admitted speaking to Connor Swain, something inside him had shifted. He hated himself for doubting her because Christina had stood beside him during the worst days of the investigation, reassuring him repeatedly whenever police pressure threatened to overwhelm him completely. Yet suspicion had a dangerous way of infecting the mind once it entered. Now every nervous glance, every carefully chosen word, every moment of hesitation began attaching itself to darker possibilities. Christina, meanwhile, appeared increasingly restless beneath the surface calm she tried maintaining. She moved around the kitchen with forced normality, but George noticed how often she lost focus midway through simple tasks. At times she seemed distracted by thoughts she could not entirely suppress. More than once, he caught her staring blankly into space before quickly correcting herself once she realized he was watching. The emotional distance growing between them frightened him almost as much as the murder investigation itself. Theo's death had not only turned the street against itself, it had started corroding trust inside private relationships too. George no longer knew whether his paranoia was justified or whether fear was simply making him see danger everywhere. Yet the more Christina attempted steering conversations away from herself, the harder it became to silence the questions forming in his mind. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Weatherfield, Summer's day began without any awareness that her name had quietly entered police discussions overnight. She moved through the morning carrying the emotional exhaustion that had followed Theo's death from the beginning, never imagining that deeply personal thoughts written during vulnerable moments could now be interpreted as evidence against her. The journal had always been a private escape, a place where anger and confusion could exist safely without judgment. She had never intended those pages to survive beyond her own emotional release. Unfortunately, murder investigations rarely respected emotional context. By late morning, DS Connor Swain had already begun reviewing the information George provided, examining the existence of the journal alongside the growing web of timelines, motives, and inconsistencies surrounding Theo's death. The detective remained outwardly composed, yet privately she understood the investigation was entering a far more dangerous phase. Too many people connected to Theo carried emotional scars linked to him. Too many individuals had reasons to resent him, fear him, or blame him for destroying parts of their lives. Untangling genuine guilt from emotional fallout was becoming increasingly complicated. Still, Connor Swain could not ignore Christina'S behavior either. During questioning at the station, Christina'S late recollection about stopping for petrol had immediately raised concerns. Detectives were trained to notice omissions, particularly when those omissions created unaccounted periods of time during the window surrounding a homicide. The fact that Christina mentioned it only after returning to the station days later unsettled investigators more than she probably realized. People forgot small details constantly under stress, but investigators knew something else too. Guilty individuals often revealed information gradually while trying to control how suspicious they appeared. That uncertainty now hung quietly over Christina, whether she realized it or not. Back on the street, George attempted distracting himself by returning briefly to routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Even ordinary interactions with neighbors carried unbearable tension because he could not stop wondering what everyone secretly believed about him. He sensed conversations pausing when he approached, eyes lingering slightly too long whenever Theo's name surfaced nearby. The investigation had transformed him from a familiar face into a possible killer in the minds of many people around him. The isolation affected him deeply because George had always depended on community, routine, and familiarity for emotional stability. Now those same things felt contaminated by suspicion. Worse still, his decision to involve Summer weighed on him constantly. Every time he imagined police questioning her about the journal, guilt tightened painfully inside him. Later that afternoon, Christina visited him again while he sat alone, visibly distracted and emotionally drained. This time, however, her concern seemed almost overly controlled, as though she had rehearsed exactly how calm she needed to appear. She tried reassuring George that he had done the right thing by speaking to Connor Swain, insisting that honesty would ultimately protect him. Yet instead of comforting him, her words deepened his discomfort further. George noticed something unsettling beneath her reassurance: urgency. It felt as though Christina needed him to believe he had acted correctly because admitting otherwise might unravel something much larger. The realization left him emotionally conflicted because part of him still desperately wanted to trust her. Admitting suspicion toward Christina meant accepting the horrifying possibility that someone he loved might be manipulating events around him while using his fear to shield themselves. That possibility became harder to ignore when the conversation drifted again toward Theo's death itself. Christina repeatedly emphasized how many people had wanted Theo gone, almost as though she were trying to normalize the idea that anyone could have snapped under emotional pressure. She mentioned his complicated relationships, the anger surrounding him, and the tension that existed before his death. Individually, none of those observations sounded strange. Collectively, however, they carried an unsettling tone that lingered with George long afterward. It sounded less like grief over a tragedy and more like justification. As all this was happening, Connor Swain continued quietly examining timelines connected to the night Theo died. One particular detail refused to leave her mind: Christina's forgotten petrol stop created precisely the kind of gap investigators searched for in homicide cases. Nobody had independently verified where Christina truly went during that time. No witnesses had yet confirmed how long she remained at the station or whether she traveled elsewhere before collecting Todd. The detective also remained aware of another disturbing element emerging within the investigation. Christina's behavior toward George appeared increasingly focused on controlling where suspicion landed. Protectiveness alone could explain some of it, but Connor Swain had investigated enough cases to recognize when fear started turning into strategic deflection. Meanwhile, Summer's vulnerability within the situation deepened without her knowledge. The emotional language inside her journal risked being stripped of nuance entirely once viewed through the lens of murder investigation. Thoughts written during moments of frustration could easily appear threatening when isolated from emotional context. George understood that better than anyone now, and the awareness haunted him relentlessly. That evening, unable to cope with his growing guilt any longer, George nearly confessed everything to Summer himself several times. He imagined warning her before police approached, imagined apologizing for betraying her trust, imagined explaining how fear and pressure had pushed him into making a terrible decision. Yet every time he considered it seriously, panic stopped him. If Christina was right and police truly believed he remained a primary suspect, any wrong move could worsen his situation dramatically. Fear continued controlling him even when guilt begged him to act differently. Back at home later that night, George noticed Christina standing alone near the living room window, staring out toward the darkened cobbles below. Something about her posture unsettled him deeply because she no longer looked simply frightened. She looked trapped inside thoughts she could not escape. For several long seconds he watched her silently, and during that silence another memory resurfaced sharply in his mind, Christina insisting they get rid of the bloody jumper immediately. At the time, panic had explained everything. Now, however, the memory attached itself to all the other inconsistencies accumulating around her. The forgotten petrol stop. The desperate push toward Summer. The visible relief after George spoke to Connor Swain. The urgency surrounding evidence. Each detail alone remained explainable. Together, however, they formed something much darker. And although George still could not bring himself to believe fully that Christina might have killed Theo, the terrifying possibility had now rooted itself too deeply inside his mind to disappear again. By the middle of the week, the emotional atmosphere surrounding Theo's murder had become so oppressive that even Weatherfield's busiest corners no longer felt alive in the same way. The cafe conversations were quieter now, interrupted constantly by nervous glances whenever police cars passed through the street. People still tried maintaining routines because routine was often the only defense against fear, yet beneath every ordinary interaction sat the same growing anxiety. Theo's death was no longer simply a tragedy being investigated. It had evolved into something more corrosive, slowly infecting friendships, relationships, and private loyalties across the entire community. For Summer, the shift began subtly at first. She noticed people behaving differently around her before anyone openly said anything suspicious. Conversations stopped too quickly whenever she entered a room. Familiar expressions suddenly carried hesitation behind them. Even casual greetings felt strained, as though neighbors were quietly re-evaluating her through the lens of rumors she herself had not yet fully heard. The emotional isolation creeping toward her felt painfully familiar because Summer had spent much of her life struggling against feelings of instability, vulnerability, and fear of becoming a burden to others. Now those fears were beginning to return in ways she could not yet fully understand. Meanwhile, George's guilt had become almost unbearable. Every hour after revealing the existence of Summer's journal to DS Connor Swain deepened his sense that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He tried repeatedly convincing himself that he had only provided investigators with information they would eventually uncover anyway, yet the justification never brought him peace. The truth remained painfully simple inside his conscience: he had betrayed someone who trusted him because fear had overwhelmed his judgment. That realization followed him everywhere. Even inside his own home, George no longer felt emotionally grounded. Christina's presence, once comforting, now created tension he struggled to hide. The more he replayed recent events in his mind, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility that Christina's behavior was driven by something far darker than ordinary concern. Her insistence on redirecting police attention, her nervousness after returning from the station, and especially the strange relief she displayed after George implicated Summer all continued haunting him relentlessly. Yet despite these growing suspicions, George still found himself emotionally trapped. Part of him desperately wanted to believe Christina remained innocent because accepting the alternative would destroy the last fragile sense of certainty he still possessed. Theo's murder had already shattered his reputation, his emotional stability, and his trust in the people around him. If Christina herself turned out to be hiding something catastrophic, George feared he might finally break beneath the pressure completely. At the police station, DS Connor Swain continued quietly building timelines surrounding the night Theo died. Although the investigation remained crowded with conflicting motives and emotional tensions, one pattern had begun standing out more clearly to her with every passing day. Christina repeatedly appeared near the center of conversations where suspicion shifted away from George and onto somebody else. Connor Swain had investigated enough violent crimes to recognize behavioral inconsistencies that often emerged under stress. Innocent people panicked constantly during investigations, particularly when loved ones became suspects. But Christina's actions carried a level of calculation that unsettled the detective more than she initially admitted even to herself. The forgotten petrol station stop continued bothering her deeply. People forgot details under pressure all the time, yet the timing of Christina's recollection felt strangely convenient. More troubling still was the emotional response she displayed while discussing it. Connor Swain remembered the nervousness in Christina's eyes, the way she seemed less concerned about the omission itself and more focused on minimizing its significance quickly before deeper questions emerged. That instinctive attempt to control perception rarely escaped an experienced investigator's notice. Meanwhile, Summer's situation worsened dramatically once police quietly began examining the journal George mentioned. Although Connor Swain approached the material cautiously, investigators inevitably interpreted certain emotional passages through the harsh framework of homicide inquiry. Expressions of anger, frustration, confusion, and emotional exhaustion suddenly appeared dangerous once detached from their original emotional context. Summer herself remained unaware of how seriously the journal was being reviewed until subtle changes in police behavior finally reached her directly. Connor Swain approached her carefully during questioning, maintaining a calm and professional tone, yet Summer immediately sensed something deeply unsettling beneath the detective's questions. The moment references emerged about her emotional state surrounding Theo, panic started building inside her chest. She realized someone had exposed the journal. The betrayal hit her with devastating force because the journal represented one of the few places where she had allowed herself complete honesty without fear of judgment. Every painful thought she had hidden from the outside world suddenly felt exposed and weaponized against her. Worse still, she quickly understood that investigators were now examining her emotional pain not as vulnerability, but as possible motive. That realization shattered something inside her. Summer's emotional reaction afterward was not explosive but quietly devastating. Once alone again, she withdrew inward almost immediately, struggling to process how deeply her privacy had been violated. She replayed recent interactions repeatedly in her mind, searching desperately for who might have betrayed her confidence. Eventually, her suspicions drifted painfully toward George and Christina because too few people even knew the journal existed. The possibility left her emotionally crushed. For George, however, the emotional damage arrived from another direction entirely. Later that evening, after learning police had already spoken with Summer, he sat alone wrestling with overwhelming guilt while Christina continued trying to reassure him that everything unfolding remained necessary. She insisted investigators needed every possible lead if George wanted to avoid charges himself. Yet instead of calming him, her arguments increasingly sounded cold and strategic. There was something disturbingly detached in the way Christina discussed Summer's growing vulnerability. She acknowledged the emotional consequences almost mechanically, but her focus always returned to protecting George from suspicion. The imbalance between compassion and urgency felt increasingly unnatural to him. At one point during their conversation, George quietly questioned whether involving Summer had truly been the right decision after all. Christina's reaction came too quickly. She immediately insisted he could not afford second thoughts now because police were already moving forward. Her tone sharpened for only a brief second before softening again, but George noticed it. More importantly, he noticed the fear underneath it. Not fear for Summer. Fear of losing control over the direction of the investigation. The realization lingered heavily in the silence afterward. As all this was happening, fragments of Theo's final days continued resurfacing throughout Weatherfield, reminding everyone how emotionally volatile the situation surrounding him had become before his death. Theo had left behind damaged relationships, unresolved resentment, emotional manipulation, and fractured trust across multiple lives. Almost everyone connected to him carried some form of anger or emotional exhaustion tied to his behavior. That complexity made the investigation dangerously chaotic because genuine grief now existed side by side with bitterness and suppressed rage. Connor Swain understood this clearly. The challenge was no longer simply identifying who had reason to hurt Theo. The challenge was determining whose emotions had escalated beyond resentment into violence. And increasingly, Christina'S behavior no longer fit neatly into the role of supportive partner caught in collateral damage. Late that night, George found himself unable to sleep again. The house remained dark and silent around him while his thoughts spiraled relentlessly between fear and suspicion. Eventually he wandered downstairs and noticed Christina sitting alone in near darkness, staring toward the street outside exactly as she had the previous evening. This time, however, he studied her more carefully without announcing his presence immediately. What disturbed him was not simply that she looked anxious. She looked haunted. There was a strange stillness in her expression. The kind people carried after emotional exhaustion had evolved into something colder and more dangerous. George suddenly remembered another detail he had overlooked before. When Christina returned from the police station earlier in the week, she had seemed shaken long before mentioning the petrol stop itself. Almost as though investigators had touched dangerously close to something she genuinely feared being discovered. The thought settled heavily over him. For the first time, George began silently revisiting the actual timeline of Theo's murder from a completely different perspective. Christina had been alone for a significant period that evening. Nobody had confirmed where she truly went. Nobody could verify how long she stopped for petrol or whether she traveled elsewhere first. And despite all the emotional chaos surrounding Theo's death, Christina herself had repeatedly guided suspicion toward other people whenever opportunities appeared. Summer. George. Anyone except herself. The horrifying possibility now forming inside George's mind no longer felt abstract anymore. It felt real enough to terrify him. And somewhere deep down, another realization began emerging alongside it. If Christina truly had killed Theo, then George himself might already have become part of her cover-up without even realizing it. The emotional pressure surrounding Theo's murder reached a new level across Weatherfield once whispers about Summer's journal began spreading quietly through the community. Nobody openly accused her at first, yet the atmosphere around her changed so noticeably that even simple interactions became painful. People who once treated her with warmth now watched her more carefully, their curiosity masked beneath polite concern. The shift was subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation, but brutal enough for Summer to feel it immediately. For someone already emotionally fragile after months of turmoil, the experience reopened wounds she had spent years trying to manage. Summer had always feared becoming defined by her lowest moments, by the emotional instability she fought privately while attempting to appear stronger than she truly felt. The journal had been her escape from that fear, a private place where she could pour out thoughts she never intended another person to read. Now those same pages were being interpreted through the cold lens of murder investigation, stripped of vulnerability and reshaped into something dangerous. The betrayal devastated her far more deeply than the police questions themselves. Once she realized investigators knew details taken directly from the journal, Summer became consumed by one painful question she could not stop replaying inside her mind: who had exposed her? The answer slowly formed with horrifying clarity because very few people even knew the journal existed. George and Christina immediately moved to the center of her suspicions, and the emotional damage caused by that realization cut deeper than anything else. She remembered evenings spent inside their home when she believed she was safe there, moments where her emotions spilled out honestly because she trusted him enough not to judge her. Looking back now, those memories felt poisoned. The idea that someone she relied on emotionally might have handed her private pain directly to police left her feeling humiliated, vulnerable, and profoundly alone. Meanwhile, George's internal conflict worsened with every passing day. Watching Summer become increasingly isolated filled him with unbearable guilt because he could see the exact emotional damage his decision had caused. Even from a distance, her body language had changed completely. She moved through the street cautiously now, carrying herself like someone expecting judgment from every direction. George recognized the look in her eyes because it mirrored his own growing exhaustion since Theo's death. Fear had transformed both of them into people barely surviving the emotional weight pressing down on Weatherfield. Yet despite his overwhelming regret, George remained trapped inside another nightmare simultaneously. His suspicions surrounding Christina continued growing stronger no matter how desperately he tried resisting them. Every new interaction between them seemed layered with hidden tension now. Christina still presented herself as supportive and protective, but George increasingly noticed how carefully she monitored conversations surrounding the investigation. Whenever police developments emerged, her reactions felt too immediate, too focused, too emotionally controlled. The woman he once trusted without hesitation now seemed permanently alert, as though constantly calculating which direction danger might move next. Late one afternoon, George found himself revisiting memories from the night Theo died in obsessive detail. He sat alone trying desperately to reconstruct timelines in his mind because the unanswered questions surrounding Christina were becoming impossible to ignore. The more he thought about it, the more disturbed he became by how much opportunity Christina had actually possessed that evening. She had been alone. Nobody could fully verify her movements during the critical window surrounding Theo's death. And perhaps most disturbingly, Christina herself had introduced the forgotten petrol station stop only after police questioning intensified around George. The realization haunted him because it suggested the possibility that Christina was not simply nervous under pressure, but actively adjusting her story as the investigation evolved. George hated himself for thinking that way because accusing Christina even silently felt emotionally unbearable. Yet once suspicion entered his thoughts, every detail began rearranging itself into darker possibilities. As all this was happening, DS Connor Swain quietly continued examining inconsistencies surrounding Christina's timeline. Unlike George, the detective approached the situation professionally rather than emotionally, yet she was arriving at similar concerns. Christina's behavior fit patterns Connor Swain had encountered before during emotionally charged homicide investigations. Innocent people often panicked, contradicted themselves, or became defensive. But what unsettled her about Christina was something more specific. Christina repeatedly attempted steering attention away from herself before investigators even fully focused on her. That instinctive deflection stood out sharply. Connor Swain also recognized another troubling pattern emerging inside the broader investigation. Theo's death had created an environment where nearly everyone connected to him carried emotional motives investigators could not easily dismiss. Theo's complicated relationships, manipulations, and emotional damage left behind an enormous field of resentment across Weatherfield. Sorting genuine grief from concealed rage was becoming increasingly difficult. Still, Christina's growing nervousness continued drawing quiet attention. Meanwhile, Summer reached an emotional breaking point after overhearing fragments of conversation suggesting her journal might now be considered significant evidence. The humiliation of realizing private emotional confessions were circulating within police discussions triggered a wave of panic she struggled to control. Memories of previous mental health struggles resurfaced painfully because the situation reinforced her deepest fear, that moments of emotional vulnerability would eventually be used against her. She withdrew further almost immediately afterward. Friends noticed the change quickly. Summer stopped lingering in public spaces, avoided conversations whenever possible, and became increasingly isolated emotionally. Even ordinary eye contact now felt unbearable because she constantly wondered whether people secretly viewed her as dangerous. The tragedy of Theo's death was no longer limited to the victim alone. It was spreading outward, destroying trust and emotional stability everywhere it touched. Back inside the house he shared with Christina, George found himself studying her constantly without intending to. He watched how she reacted whenever the investigation came up, how her expression tightened whenever police were mentioned, how quickly she redirected conversations towards Summer or other suspects whenever uncomfortable details surfaced. The emotional strain of living alongside growing suspicion was slowly destroying him because he no longer knew whether his instincts reflected genuine warning signs or paranoia born from trauma. One particular moment unsettled him more deeply than any previous conversation. That evening, while discussing recent police developments, George hesitantly admitted he regretted involving Summer at all. He expected Christina to reassure him gently or acknowledge the emotional damage caused. Instead, her reaction carried sharp urgency almost immediately. She insisted he needed to stop doubting himself because investigators were already moving forward. According to her, there was no point looking backward now. The intensity behind her response chilled him. It sounded less like someone comforting a guilty partner and more like someone terrified he might reverse course and start asking dangerous questions instead. George noticed it instantly. And for the first time since Theo's death, he experienced a horrifying new fear growing beneath all the others, the possibility that Christina might not only be hiding something, but actively manipulating him into protecting her without his knowledge. The emotional implications shattered something inside him because George had already sacrificed Summer's trust under pressure. If Christina truly was guilty, then he had unknowingly helped redirect suspicion toward an innocent person while shielding the actual killer. That possibility became impossible to ignore later that night. Unable to sleep again, George wandered downstairs and discovered Christina sitting alone near the kitchen table in near darkness. The street lights outside cast faint shadows across her face, and for several silent seconds he simply watched her without speaking. She looked emotionally exhausted, yet beneath the exhaustion sat something colder he could not fully explain. Not grief. Not fear alone. Something more guarded. When Christina finally noticed him standing there, she startled slightly before forcing a calm expression back into place. The reaction lasted only a moment, but it was enough. George suddenly realized she seemed perpetually on edge lately, as though terrified of being caught off guard. The atmosphere between them had become painfully unnatural. Neither of them fully trusted the silence anymore because too many unspoken thoughts now existed beneath every interaction. George wanted desperately to confront her directly, to ask whether there was something she had not told police, whether Theo's death involved truths he still did not understand. Yet fear stopped him every time. Because deep down, George already sensed that once those questions were spoken aloud, nothing between them would ever feel safe again. Meanwhile, Connor Swain quietly arranged follow-up inquiries regarding Christina's movements the night Theo died. The detective remained cautious because circumstantial suspicion alone meant very little in cases driven heavily by emotional chaos. Still, Christina's increasingly strategic behavior could no longer be dismissed as ordinary stress. And somewhere within the growing darkness surrounding the investigation, the possibility that Christina Boyd was protecting not George, but herself, was beginning to harden into something far more dangerous than rumor. By the end of the week, Weatherfield no longer felt like a community trying to recover from tragedy. It felt like a place slowly collapsing beneath the emotional weight of suspicion, secrets, and betrayal. Theo's murder had exposed fractures inside relationships that many people never realized were already breaking apart, and now those fractures were widening dangerously with every new development in the investigation. The police still had no definitive answer, yet the uncertainty itself had become destructive enough to damage lives long before any arrest was made. For Summer, the emotional consequences of becoming linked to the case were devastating. The knowledge that her private journal had somehow entered police discussions stripped away what little sense of safety she still possessed. She moved through the street carrying visible exhaustion now, emotionally raw in a way she could no longer hide behind polite smiles or forced composure. Every glance from neighbors felt loaded with suspicion, and even the people who genuinely cared about her seemed uncertain how to approach her anymore. What hurt most was not simply the police attention itself, but the realization that someone close to her had betrayed her trust during the worst possible moment. Summer replayed countless conversations in her mind, searching desperately for the point where safety had disappeared. The journal had never been intended as evidence of violence or hatred. It had been the desperate emotional outlet of someone struggling to survive overwhelming confusion and fear. Yet now those deeply personal thoughts existed inside an investigation where context no longer mattered. The emotional isolation surrounding her grew heavier each day. Meanwhile, George's guilt reached a level that became physically difficult to carry. He no longer recognized himself inside the decisions fear had forced him to make. Watching Summer unravel emotionally because of information he provided to police filled him with crushing shame, especially as his suspicions surrounding Christina continued deepening underneath everything else. He had betrayed Summer believing he was protecting himself from suspicion, but now another horrifying possibility consumed him constantly. What if he had sacrificed an innocent person while unknowingly helping shield Theo's real killer? The thought poisoned nearly every moment he spent with Christina. Although she continued trying to behave normally, the emotional strain surrounding her was becoming impossible to disguise completely. George noticed it constantly now, the way her expression tightened whenever police developments surfaced, the way she monitored conversations too carefully, and especially the way she always seemed focused on controlling where attention landed next. Her fear no longer resembled ordinary anxiety. It looked increasingly like desperation. One evening, while sitting together in near silence, George found himself studying Christina as she absent-mindedly stared into space. The exhaustion visible on her face should have inspired sympathy, yet instead it triggered something colder inside him. He suddenly realized that ever since returning from the police station earlier that week, Christina had never once truly expressed grief for Theo himself. Her emotions revolved entirely around the investigation, suspicion, evidence, and survival. That realization unsettled him profoundly. Because everyone else connected to Theo, regardless of anger or resentment, still carried some visible emotional reaction to the fact a man had lost his life. Summer was emotionally collapsing. Todd remained shattered by grief and confusion. The entire street carried tension because Theo's death had traumatized the community in different ways. Christina, however, seemed emotionally consumed only by the consequences surrounding the murder rather than the murder itself. George could no longer ignore how unnatural that felt. As all this was happening, DS Connor Swain quietly pushed deeper into Christina's timeline from the night Theo died. Investigators confirmed the petrol station stop had occurred, yet significant uncertainty still surrounded how long Christina remained there and whether she traveled anywhere else beforehand. Surveillance footage gaps, incomplete witness recollections, and conflicting timing estimates left enough unanswered questions to keep investigators interested. Connor Swain remained cautious professionally because suspicion alone solved nothing. Still, the detective trusted instinct developed through years of emotionally complex investigations, and increasingly her instincts warned her that Christina Boyd was hiding something significant. Perhaps not murder itself, but certainly something. Meanwhile, cracks inside George and Christina's relationship continued widening quietly beneath the surface. Their conversations had become careful and emotionally restrained, filled with pauses where trust once existed naturally. George increasingly caught himself filtering every word before speaking because he no longer knew how much Christina herself might already suspect about his growing doubts. The emotional distance between them became unbearable. Late one night, unable to carry the tension any longer, George finally confronted part of what had been tormenting him. The conversation began cautiously at first, with George simply asking Christina whether she had told police absolutely everything about the night Theo died. The question itself immediately altered the atmosphere inside the room. Christina froze almost imperceptibly before answering. Although she quickly insisted she had nothing to hide, George noticed the defensive sharpness underneath her response. More importantly, he noticed fear flickering across her face before she regained control over her expression. The reaction lasted only seconds, yet it confirmed something inside him he could no longer dismiss. Christina was terrified. Not simply stressed. Terrified. The realization made George's stomach turn because deep down he already understood something crucial about fear. People feared being falsely accused all the time, but Christina's fear carried the emotional intensity of someone frightened by what investigators might actually uncover. The silence following their conversation felt colder than anything either of them said aloud. Meanwhile, Summer finally reached an emotional point where she could no longer suppress her pain quietly. After enduring days of suspicion, isolation, and whispers surrounding the journal, she broke down privately while confronting the devastating reality that someone she trusted had exposed her vulnerabilities to police. The emotional damage cut deeply because Summer had spent years trying to believe she could rely on people again despite previous betrayals and trauma. Now even that fragile trust felt destroyed. Elsewhere across Weatherfield, conversations surrounding Theo's murder became increasingly focused on Christina as rumors slowly began spreading about inconsistencies in her account. Nobody openly accused her yet, but small details were starting to connect in ways people could not entirely ignore. Questions emerged quietly about why she suddenly remembered stopping for petrol only after returning from police questioning. Others began revisiting how aggressively she encouraged George to speak about Summer's journal despite once being close to her. The atmosphere surrounding Christina shifted subtly but unmistakably. People were beginning to watch her differently. Connor Swain noticed the same shift while continuing to review witness statements and behavioral patterns linked to the investigation. What troubled the detective most was not any single piece of evidence, but the emerging emotional pattern surrounding Christina's actions after Theo's death. Again and again, Christina appeared focused on one objective above all else, redirecting attention toward George initially, then towards Summer. Anywhere except herself. That pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Back inside the house later that night, George sat alone after Christina had gone upstairs, unable to escape the horrifying conclusions forming inside his mind. He replayed everything repeatedly: the bloody jumper Christina insisted they get rid of, the forgotten petrol stop, the visible relief after he betrayed Summer, the panic whenever police questioned timelines too closely. Individually, every detail still carried possible explanations. Together, however, they formed something far darker. And for the first time since Theo's death shattered Weatherfield, George finally allowed himself to confront the possibility he had spent days desperately avoiding. If Christina truly killed Theo, then the entire nightmare suddenly made terrifying sense. Her desperation to protect George was never really about saving him. It was about controlling the investigation. Her push towards Summer was never about justice. It was about creating another suspect. And George himself, frightened, exhausted, emotionally broken George, may already have become the perfect shield hiding the truth from everyone else. As the realization settled over him completely, George felt physically sick because he finally understood the true horror of what Theo's murder had unleashed across Weatherfield. The crime itself was only the beginning. The real destruction came afterward, through fear powerful enough to turn trust into suspicion, loyalty into betrayal, and love itself into something terrifyingly uncertain.